Hello and welcome to this morning's Logistics Manager website with Pledge and Zen Cargo. My name is Michelle Mooney and I'm the acting editor of Logistics Manager magazine. So welcome to this webinar entitled Supply Chain Transparency and Emissions. Today we will be learning about how data can be used to create operational transparency, allowing you to effectively measure and reduce carbon emissions. Sustainability continues to be a C-suite business imperative for logistics and transportation providers, demonstrating your sustainability is an ever-growing consumer expectation and a business differentiator. Before we start the discussion today, I would like to introduce our speakers. So I'd like to welcome first Gerald Chafimba, Head of Business Development at Pledge, as well as Ian Powell, Head of Solutions Consulting at Zen Cargo. So Gerald, first, would you like to give us a small introduction to yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be on the webinar. My name is Gerald. As you mentioned, I lead business development at Pledge. And very quickly, Pledge's mission is to help deliver best-in-class tools and infrastructure that enable businesses to become, firstly, more climate aware, but secondly, accelerate their transition to net zero, which is obviously an imperative right now. So yeah, glad to be on the webinar.
Perfect, thank you. Ian, could you please give us an introduction to yourself?
Sure, certainly. Thanks a lot for the invite. Ian Powell, Head of Solutions Consulting at Zen Cargo. Essentially, my role is to work with existing customers to drive value projects as a freight forwarder for them. I also work internally developing some product solutions within our overall value proposition. So nice to meet everyone.
Perfect, thank you guys very much. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to start with a poll and also to remind our viewers separately that you're free to contribute any questions throughout this discussion. If you'd like to pose any questions to Ian or Gerald, please put those in the chat box in the bottom of your screen. But firstly, I will introduce a poll to everyone. So the question to this is, to what extent are you measuring your transportation emissions today? So A, every shipment, B, partially, or C, not at all. So you guys will have an opportunity to submit your responses to that. So we've already got a lot of people responding. Yeah, so I think it's probably going to be partially looking at the results. Okay, so thank you. So while that poll is going on, yeah, I think the result of that, so we do have a response now. So I think most people said partially to that question, so that's very interesting. So I think we should move on to our first question for our speakers today. So companies are trying to become net zero in the future, and the only way they can understand how climate positive they are is to better understand their scope 3 logistics emissions. And as an example, Green Core Group also commits to reduce its scope 3 greenhouse gas logistics emissions from purchased goods and services, and aims to upstream transportation and distribution by 42% per ton. And the company is committed to achieving net zero by 2040. On that, decarbonization has been a topic for decades. What's made it a priority for your business today? Gerald, could you please give us some information on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point, we've known about the effects of climate change for a long time, but it's only recently that there's been more movement on the regulatory side, as we saw in the US with the SEC guidance that's forcing the majority of companies listed in the US to start to report on their emissions, including scope 3 emissions. And then we've also seen over the last couple of years, thousands of companies commit to net zero targets. So it's very much come into focus. And also we see in our own environment that climate change is having a wider impact. So I think all of that has accumulated in companies now taking more action. And And also they see an opportunity to be a sustainability leader, right? So as consumers choose where they put their pounds, that's also been a driver in companies starting to look at this topic in a bit more detail than previously.
Thank you. Ian, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if I just look reflection from the businesses that we work with, I think there's a couple of things, right? One is that proximity paradox to some extent, where organizations are now kind of increasingly evaluating their options and doubling down on their efforts to deliver on really, should we say, positively contributing towards the commitments of Paris 2015, but also really those kind of subsequent commitments of COPs 27, where we're looking at halving emissions by 2030, and then obviously reaching that net zero target by 2050. So I think it's that proximity paradox to some extent. Picking up on what Gerald said, right, it's also about consumers becoming more socially conscious about their purchases and what they purchase and who they purchase from. And typically, I think there's a shift towards those brands that have sustainability and ethical practices. It's one of their core values or part of their core values. And I think that increasingly drives organizations to act right. And I think kind of dovetailed into that is, in some extent, is also that brand equity piece. So it's organizations want to build sustainable and long-term business. And principally, they're kind of reliant on then positive consumer perception and experience of that brand or of that organization. So I think those are the three main factors that really kind of resonate with what we're seeing across our customer base.
Perfect, thank you. So I think that leads us on to our next question. So obviously it's difficult for companies to properly measure their scope 3 emissions. Can you please give us more information into how this can be done more effectively in the future from this point forward? So Gerald, would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah, and we'll dig into this topic a little bit more, but I think in principle the challenge is that until now the majority of companies haven't been measuring. So it's actually the starting on that journey is kind of the first point of call, really, and getting a hold of understanding what your supply chain look like, where the data might be held, and really committing to start. I think, and we can dig into how we best do that. But I think at this point, the majority of companies are not doing any scope 3 transportation measurement. And as you can see from the poll, over 60, it looks like 70%, 80% of companies are either partially or not measuring transportation emissions at all. So the starting point is just get started, and hopefully we can cover how to best do that today.
Perfect, thank you. So Zen Cargo as a digital freight forwarder, supply chain visibility is key, obviously. So how has that allowed you to measure your carbon emissions, Ian?
Yeah, so obviously that digital freight forwarder component is really key there. And as a technology offering, we provide our customers with SKU, purchase order, and shipment level visibility, and that includes like milestone status and tracking information. But principally, that provides that level of visibility provides us with that base data to be able to really, should we say, collate the necessary inputs that underpin the capability that we've built with Pledge to measure and report on our customers' scope 3 transport emissions. So I think the key point there is digital platform. We aggregate a lot of customer supply chain data, and that's really how we build the capability to provide the measurement. I think from our point of view as well is it's providing that CO2 emissions measurement and reporting is one of the key components of our overall value proposition. So that in itself is becoming valuable for our customers. Referenceable examples of that is the collaboration work that we did with Vivo to really develop the requirements around the solution, but also then pilot it. And that's kind of the basis of what we use to then also develop our relationship with Pledge. But beyond that, it's kind of quite important because now we have the capability and we've rolled out that measurement and reporting across 100% of our customers. We also then have additional pillars to our overall solution, and we're working with a subset of customers on reduction initiatives, but also offsetting opportunities, and that offsetting opportunities is equally supported by Pledge.io with regards to how it's facilitated. So
yeah, that's perfect. I have another question for Gerald. So you mentioned data quality is one of the challenges. What are some other challenges that companies face?
Yeah, so maybe even taking a step back, the question is really how do organizations measure emissions today? And there's a couple of ways of doing that. So the two primary ways that you can measure transportation emissions today is either using fuel usage, so fuel data, and that obviously requires you to own the transportation, the fleets that are moving the goods on your behalf. And this is by far the most accurate way of measuring emissions today. But what we see is that this data is not available. Either the carriers themselves that have the data haven't operationalized it in a way that it can be used to estimate emissions, or if you're a shipper or freight forwarder or freight buyer, you just simply don't have access to that information because carriers are either unable to or not willing to share that information for various reasons. And this is particularly true in air or sea freight. And so in the absence of that, the option that you really have is estimating emissions based on activity. And so what I mean by activity is we look at, okay, we have a shipment from A to B, and so we say, what do we know about that shipment? So we know the origin and destination, or we know the distance that's traveled. So that's one data point. The weight of the shipment itself, the vehicle or vehicles that have moved that shipment throughout that shipment life cycle. And there's more data points that you can consider, but you essentially take these data points and you can estimate the emissions using what we call default values. Now, this approach has several challenges, including data quality, and I can dig into that a little bit further. But one of the other challenges is that to estimate emissions in this way requires you to use these emission factors or default values that are often based on averages of real world data. So you can imagine that you're getting kind of layers and layers removed from reality. And so in between that, there's one other approach that you can take that better estimates emissions, and that's something called a modeled approach. So there you say, okay, we don't have the fuel usage, right? So that's off the table. But if we have more granular activity information, so outside of knowing, the shipment weighs this, it's going this far, we can say, hey, actually, we know it's on this particular container ship with this IMO number, or hey, we know that this air freight shipment is on this particular flight or has this aircraft code or this flight number. That helps us to model the emissions and get to a more granular answer. And so there are these different approaches. And what's really important at that beginning phase is to map out what data do I have available to me, and what's the best approach based on the data that I have. Once you have that data, you then need to apply a methodology, right? And there are various methodologies that exist for measuring emissions. The primary methodology is called the GHG protocol. But if you're looking for a logistics-focused or sector-specific methodology, there's something called the GLEC framework. And so that methodology looks at what are the best approaches for each mode of transport. So for air shipments, what is the best approach there? There's something called the ICAR methodology. For sea, what's the best approach there? There's something called the Clean Cargo Working Group that come up with emission factors specifically for that sector. And so in the best case scenario, what you want to do is assess the data that you have available to you, and then apply the best methodology based on the types of goods that you're moving. And then it's a matter of then plugging those into a formula and to come up with those estimates. So that's essentially how organizations are measuring emissions today. And then you mentioned kind of data quality is obviously one of the challenges. That's absolutely true. So what we generally find is that, and this is from working with Zencargo and their many customers, but also working with other freight forwarders and shippers directly, is that data quality is crucial because, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So if you put in, estimates that are not either based on what's actually happening, or you put in kind of a few data points where, we have a rough estimate of the distance, we have a rough estimate of the weight, then obviously the output is not going to be reliable. And what I would say is there are probably 2 or 3 other things that stand out in terms of impacting the quality of emissions. The other one is being able to compare. So again, one of the things that we find is that people are getting emissions estimates from some suppliers and not getting emissions estimates from others. One approach is being used here, one approach is being used there. And ultimately, for you to understand your emissions, you need to be able to compare apples to apples. So really understanding the methodology behind any estimates that you use to build your baseline or to start to build a reduction strategy. It's really important to have the audit trail of how those emissions are being measured. And then the last thing that I'll add is one of the fundamental principles that we see, and this is based on the GHG protocol's carbon accounting principles, is that you really want to make sure there's a level of assurance on the estimates that you put forward. This space in general is early, right? Where we're using these estimates to make claims, to build strategies. And in the same way that you would expect financial information to have a level of assurance, the same will be expected of emissions estimates. So there we say, hey, don't mark your own homework. Make sure that the data you're using for the inputs has a level of assurance, third-party assurance to it. And then also the approach to measuring and the actual measurement itself has a level of third-party assurance. So I'd say those are the kind of the key lessons in terms of how to approach measuring emissions, but also some of the pitfalls to try to avoid if you want to do it well.
Perfect, thank you. Ian, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think Gerald covered the topic pretty comprehensively there. I think that the advantage for us, and at least the kind of the key with working with Pledge, is that they essentially have the computation ability to run all of these calculations. We have the input data, and we have the assurance of the quality of that input data. And Pledge, obviously, they make the computations based on the recognised standards and methodologies, and that really drives quite a high level of confidence, both for us and for our customers, that they actually have a quality measurement and it's appropriate. And then the kind of next component is that it really provides that firm foundation for driving reduction and offsetting strategies. So that's the key thing for us, and really that's the key motivation behind why we opted to go into partnership with Pledge to really drive the solution that we have in place today.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I think I'll go on to the next question then. So thank you guys for outlining some of the challenges companies face and how they can get around those. There's clearly opportunities for companies to measure emissions, which, as you've mentioned, disclose to stakeholders, using that to build a reduction plan. So that's really useful. So in the next section of the webinar, we are going to focus on how companies use carbon data to address and reduce their emissions. But before we kick off, first, I think we can go on to our next poll. So I will pose that question to our audience. So how are you using carbon emissions data today? Please select what is relevant. So A, for reporting purposes, B, strategic decision making, C, operational efficiency, or D, not at all. And that poll is open to you guys to answer now. So how are you using your carbon emissions data today? Select all that is applicable. So we have a bunch of results coming in. I think the winner might be for reporting purposes. You guys have, I'll give you guys 10 more seconds to enter your results. No, I think we're done. Yeah, I think, yeah, so the primary result was for reporting purposes. So I think that's really interesting. So I think with that, we will go on to our next section, so reduction and reporting. So based on the polling feedback, can you give us a few examples of how you see emissions information being used by companies to help reduce their carbon footprint? Gerald, I'll go to you. Could you please tell us more?
Yeah, sure. I think the poll results are quite interesting, actually. So the primary reason that we see companies using CO2 information is for reporting purposes, because that's where there's, depending on who you are, there's a regulatory requirement to do so. But it's really encouraging to see that increasingly companies are actually using CO2 information to guide decision making and look for operational efficiencies as well. So so this really lines up with what we see from speaking to our customers and our partners as well. And one of the shifts that we think needs to happen is that usually companies are measuring emissions in a one-off yearly exercise. And so this data is not being used operationally most of the time, and is not an operational KPI. And so this transition needs to happen where actually you need to be measuring emissions continuously and be able to look at it month to month rather than year to year. And then the power of it is then you can apply frameworks for reducing emissions. So the usual framework that you see is the kind of avoid, shift, improve approach, right? And so you want to avoid some movements if you can, right? So kind of reduce demand on freight demand, which is obviously reduce your emissions. You want to shift your emissions, or you want to shift from high emitting transport to low emitting transport. And that's where you see modal shift and some efficiencies being produced there. And you obviously want to improve, and a lot of that improve sits with the carriers themselves in terms of improving the efficiency of the fleets and the vehicles that they use. And so you have this pick and mix of options in terms of maybe it's supply chain restructuring, localization, or it can be load optimization and consolidation, which is something Ian can talk about in more detail. We're a little bit outside of that. But either way, you can then start to use the CO2 information to look at what you're currently doing, but also model what these different reduction initiatives could mean for the business, and where you can find the best short-term opportunities, but also look at some medium and long-term opportunities as well. And I think CO2 information is fundamental to doing that, so that when you're doing, for example, network design, you're not only looking at cost and distance, but you're also looking at the CO2 impact when you're looking at transportation optimization, etc. So that's really where we see the trend going. But yeah, really encouraging to see that so many in the audience are already starting to use CO2 data for strategic decision making.
Perfect, thank you. Ian, I want to hear your insights on this.
Yeah, sure. And I think those results are pretty much reflective of what we see as well, right? So as Gerald mentioned earlier, the key there is around the reporting purposes, and typically kind of what we've seen is that organizations are looking at reporting just for a specific period, but you really need to look at it more broadly than that. So, you know, part of the reporting analytics that we provide is also to look at periodic comparisons, or periodic comparisons between this year and last year based on the different types of modes, the number of shipments, and looking at emissions intensity across multiple periods, right? So you can see how you're performing. So I think that's a key point there. But kind of dovetailing into that reporting, it's also about part of our pillars of the sustainable solution that we offer is about driving reduction. And that requires a certain critical mass of data, right? So we need to start aggregating supply chain data to look at then further analysis on what opportunities can we drive to improve supply chain performance, but also kind of as a byproduct of that, right, there's also opportunity to drive reduction and optimization of emissions, right? So Gerald picked up on some key things, but a lot of things we work with customers is looking at container equipment utilization. We look at, shipment consolidation, whether that's bio-console or co-loading. We look at optimizing low carbon routes, and that could also be complemented with insetting, buying sustainable fuels as part of your purchasing strategy. The mode shift is another example there, where you're looking at, should we say, less pollutant modes of transport. And it can also include things like air freight routings, right? So selecting direct routings instead of indirect services where you're doing multiple stops. So there's a combination of different initiatives that we might drive to kind of optimize supply chain performance, but also drive reduction in emissions. And it's not really kind of one size fits all. It really customer specific, depending on, you know, their supply chain setup, you know, the different supply chain structures that they have. But typically, like the data that we start to aggregate is we start to then drive some you know, decision making around what and how to drive improvement and really drive reduction. It's never going to get to a point where, from a supply chain point of view, you're able to reduce all of your emissions, right? So you need to think about what's the next mechanism to support your overall reduction strategy or your overall sustainability strategy. And I think, you know, the third pillar then of our offering is around offsetting, you know, and making that available to our customers.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So it's a really insightful conversation so far. So I'd now like to ask, by virtue of the way supply chains work, do you think it's impossible for companies to reduce their Scope 3 emissions in isolation? Gerald, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think part of the challenge that we see every day is when we're speaking to brands and shippers directly, and they want to start on that journey, the first thing they say is, "Oh, I'm actually struggling to get this data from my carrier or my logistics provider." So inherently, there needs to be collaboration, certainly on the data sharing side, but I think there's also an opportunity for companies to embed that collaboration within their procurement and purchasing policies, right? So instead of halfway through a contract with someone saying, "Hey, can you share this data?" Actually embedding it and say, as part of our agreement, you agree to collaborate and help us on this journey that we're on. Mm-hmm. What's promising is that there is movement on that. So the Smart Freight Center, for example, are working on a data access procedure. So looking at how to work with carriers and logistics providers and shippers to standardize the data, standardize the data integrations, and create a data exchange protocol that allows for that collaboration across the supply chain, so that the end shipper who's also accountable for their emissions can easily access that data in a standardized way across the supply chain. So I think certainly on the data side, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I think if you're a shipper right now, you certainly need to be thinking about, how do I proactively embed that collaboration into how I work with suppliers? So for example, working with someone like Zen Cargo, who's proactively providing CO2 emissions, is very different to someone who isn't even sharing the activity information for you to do your own computations, right? So I think that collaboration is absolutely necessary and vital, because of the nature of Scope 3 emissions as well. It's outside of your control. They're called indirect emissions for a reason, so you have no direct control over them. And the best way to map those reductions is to find ways to collaborate with partners forcibly and but also proactively in a more supportive way as well.
Perfect. Ian, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, so I think kind of more broadly speaking, right, there's you know, we essentially operate on a global network, right, and there's probably some value in, you know, in freight forwarders, in asset owners and non-asset owners also driving a certain degree of collaboration, and not for the purpose of a singular customer account, but looking, you know, broadly across multiple customer accounts where you have critical mass that you can drive that additional optimization and drive more efficiency. And I think that's a kind of key thing that will also, you know, improve supply chain performance with regards to CO2 and emissions. But typically, I think Gerald addresses the main point, right, which is about that immediate collaboration that's needed to surface more of this data, to make the data more available, to be more transparent and really work with the different stakeholders in your supply chain to get access to this data, to have then the ability to report, right, and understand what your baseline is. I think that's really the starting point. Beyond that, I think there's a lot of things that can be done, but initially that primary collaboration to gather the data, to be more transparent, and to then, you know, report correctly is really key.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I would just like to give another reminder to all of our viewers today that we do have some time for questions. So if anything that has been discussed today so far by either of our speakers interests you or you'd like to know more about, if you could submit those questions, we do have a question and answer box that you're free to pose your questions to, but we do already have a couple of questions to ask our speakers, so I'll start with those now. Gerald or Ian, what do you do when you don't have the data available?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It depends on what data you don't have, but I think what's really helpful about, for example, the GLEC framework that I mentioned earlier and some of these methodologies is that they allow you to have a starting point. So if you go and look at some of these methodologies, if you just know the distance traveled, so let's say I don't even know what the weight of my goods were, that's enough to start to get an estimate. If you then can provide more information like the weight of the shipment and a rough estimate of the vehicle type, that can give you an estimate. Now, the challenge is that those estimates, the way the methodology works is that the less data that you provide, the more conservative the estimates have to be. And so if you don't have good quality data, the methodologies essentially almost punish you and try to encourage you to go and dig for that data. So all of that to say, to start, you simply just need the distance or even just the origin and destination and an estimate of the vehicle type. That's the bare minimum. If you then can get the weight and can be more specific about the vehicle types, that obviously improves the calculation. But then it does limit how you use those estimates, right? But yeah, there's definitely a starting point, even if you haven't got a good hold of your data just yet.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think just what, and maybe beyond that starting point, it's also really imperative to kind of set out the stall about how you're going to improve that data quality, right? Because it's to your advantage to do that, because then essentially the output that you get is far more accurate. And like I say, like Gerald says, right, the key there is that the methodologies penalise you for not actually having the right level of data. So you need to really set that stall out as part of your should we say, sustainability strategy and how you're going to deliver on really getting valuable and high quality measurements.
Perfect. So we do have another question from our audience. So is there a way to benchmark your emissions against others moving on the same route? Ian or Gerald, would you like to interject?
Yeah, so that's one thing that we're developing now at Zen Cargo. So doing some comparative analysis, and I think ultimately we have quite a big customer base to be able to really give our customers some insights on how they're performing in comparison to their peers. So I think the answer is yes, at least from our point of view. The question is, are you able to get that more broadly? You know. I couldn't say specifically for your other freight forwarders or your other freight providers, but it is certainly something from a data-driven insights perspective that we really want to give to our customers, because we think that gives them a good reference point to see where their supply chain is in comparative to either industry peers and or people shipping on the same trade lanes, the same mode of transport, utilizing the same equipment type, etc. So for us, it's really something that we're developing as part of the overall reporting package.
Perfect. So we have another question. Somebody asks, does GLEC have a standardized reporting template? So that's Global Logistics Emissions Council. Do you?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So the GLEC framework does have a standardized reporting framework. They're called GLEC disclosures, and actually within our the Pledge platform, you can generate those, and so you have a standardized framework where you show the overall activity, so number of ton kilometers traveled, and then you get the overall emissions, and then it provides a breakdown across modes of transport, and also indicates the quality of the data. So there are different types of data, as we were discussing, in terms of quality. So it also provides a split of where that data has come from, if it's program-based, if it's default data, etc. So yeah, there's a standard exists that is already kind of codified within our product. and it was also available through the Zencargo platform.
Perfect. So we have another question. So they say that their entire supply chain relies on express air freight. So they ask, is there a way to reduce emissions on air freight apart from keeping volumetric weight down as low as possible?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me, some of those things, so some of the things you might look at there is obviously looking at your routing specifically is a key. So if you're using indirect routings where you might be, transshipping via multiple airports, like, do you want to buy more? Do you want to balance your portfolio to buy more direct routing options? Right? Why are you flying 6,000 miles where a direct routing would allow you to fly 4,500 miles, as an example? So that's one thing there. There's also the option to kind of inset as well, so buy more sustainable fuels as part of your procurement strategy, and that obviously reduces your emissions output at source because you're using, should we say, less environmentally, should we say, impactful fuels. So those are two mechanisms that are arguably available to express air freight carriers, right, or shippers who depend on express air freight as their primary mode of transport.
Perfect. So we have another question. So this may be more of an ethical question. So why is measuring carbon emissions important in a business, especially in logistics?
Ian, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Either one of you are free to.
Yeah, I think for us, if you take the view that carbon has a price, right? So, emitting has a cost to society as a whole, has a cost to the economy. And you can look up estimates for the total costs, for example, for adaptation as climate change starts to impact certain regions of the world. Someone has to pay that cost. And then at an organizational level, I think it's helpful to understand the climate impact of what you're doing. Obviously, there's a wider debate that we probably shouldn't get into about the science behind it and et cetera, and the different views. But I think either way, carbon will be priced or will likely be priced either via tax or via other regulation. So as an organization, outside of the societal view, it's helpful to understand whether your business model is viable if the government tomorrow were to say there is this tax on carbon. So for that reason alone, I think it's important, but wider to that, I think it helps inform a sustainability strategy if you have one, and best prepares you for whatever regulatory change will come in the future. That's my best answer I think I can give, but it's a big question.
Perfect. Ian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you can get into many debates.
It's a very open question.
Yeah, I think you can get into many, there's a lot of ethical debate around it and different opinions on that one specifically. But I think the key for me is kind of just to reiterate what Gerald said, right? It's about understanding what your impact is. And then I think that gives you the opportunity to take responsibility for that impact. So, it's more of an ethical point, I think, but ultimately it's about kind of taking responsibility for the impact you have on the planet and then actually putting in place that strategy on how you can minimize your impact. I think those are the key points behind it. Yeah, and there's different viewpoints, right? But for me, those are the primary things that I think are the importance of measuring your CO2 supply chain emissions, or just CO2 emissions in general. Right?
Yeah. I think I'd agree with that. So I think we have one final question. This is probably one of my favorites. So carbon offsetting is a tool for companies to progress their net zero ambitions, but how do you avoid the risk of greenwashing, which some companies are guilty of, as we've seen? But how do you possibly avoid that?
Yeah, so I don't know, Gerald, do you want to talk around specifically the carbon offsetting projects and portfolios that you guys have made accessible to us, and some of the key kind of like components around how you how you make those auditable and traceable?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a really good question because I think that risk is there, right? The greenwashing risk. And often the risk is based on the claims that are being made. So there's a couple of things that you can easily do. One is if you're purchasing carbon offsets, make sure they're high quality carbon offsets. And that's a very specific term. And it relates to the due diligence of and credibility of that project. So in terms of our marketplace, the pledge marketplace, we ensure that we apply our own due diligence lens, which looks at the properties of the project itself. So is this project actually having a climate impact? Is it additional? Is the money being invested actually helping pull carbon out of the atmosphere, or this is a process that was going to happen anyway? It looks at the permanence. So if you're locking carbon out of the atmosphere or stopping carbon entering the atmosphere, how long is that for? Is it 100 years, 1,000 years? So there's that lens in terms of the science, but then there's a practical element of actually looking at where you source the projects from, the project documentation, and reviewing that and making sure that what you're purchasing is what's actually happening. And so within our marketplace, we do all of that heavy lifting. So that when you go and purchase carbon offsets, they're the right credits that have the kind of the due diligence behind it. Then there's a wider question about actually how the carbon offsets fit into your strategy. That's really important. If you're on a net zero strategy, then you need to be focused on removals projects, which are projects that suck carbon out of the atmosphere versus avoiding carbon from entering the atmosphere. So that's a really key distinction. And then making sure that that aligns with the claims that you make. And a lot of the greenwashing risk is that often marketing teams get involved and start to stretch here we planted this many trees, but actually the reality is very different. So I think it's just about being transparent and open about exactly what's going on and making sure that you've done the homework behind what you're investing in. So I would say that that's probably the best way to manage the risk. Being clear about communication and making sure you've done your homework on procuring the right credits.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question. So this is open to both of you. What do you say the top skepticism is around net zero and environmental initiatives, and even approaches such as carbon accounting? What makes people apprehensive?
Yeah, I can. Go ahead, Ian.
No, go on.
Yeah, I think there's. I think historically there's not been a great deal of transparency, as with any emerging space where you don't have good practices or you don't have best practices established, and people see an opportunity, especially for marketing purposes, for other reasons. You inevitably have bad actors, and then those bad actors then apply, give the space or the practices or methodologies a bad rap. The best way to counter that, and I've worked in several sectors, what's always been true is transparency, right? So making sure that you're transparent about how you're doing things, not claiming that this is 100% accurate, but actually just being transparent about this is the methodology that we're using. It could be improved in these ways. These are the carbon offsets that we're purchasing, and this is the credibility behind them. And that transparency allows for credibility to grow and trust to grow over time. And within our approach at Pledge, we've actually embedded that into the product. So instead of talking about it, it's actually in there. So for example, when Zen Cargo is running computations for their emissions estimates, for every computation, there's an audit trail of exactly the methodology that's been used, the emission factors that have been used, the assumptions that have been made, so that we can say, hey, this is what we think is working now, but if in the future, if there's a better approach, we know how it's been done and we can go and improve things over time. So I would say that's one of the things that we can work on. Is there's not been that much transparency before, and the best way to manage the skepticism and kind of get over that hurdle is to be as transparent and as open as possible.
Yeah. And I think the key point about that transparency as well, right? It drives then improvement, and it drives the motivation for us as an organization, but obviously Pledge as a provider, right, to improve the algorithms, the computation methodology and approach, right? So there are knock-on effects of that transparency. And I think so long as everyone is open about what they're doing, how they're doing it, what methodologies they're using, what the output is, and how that output can be improved over time, then essentially the space will just become a lot more kind of managed, regulated, controlled than it historically has been.
Perfect. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions. So with that, I would just like to say that it was a wonderful discussion, really insightful. And I'd like to say thank you to both Pledge and Zen Cargo for participating, as well as Gerald and Ian for giving their wonderful insights. A recording of this video, if this discussion, will be available on the Logistics Manager website in the next few days. So you will be able to watch this on demand and share amongst yourselves and your colleagues. So do take the time to do so. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you. And my name is Michelle Mooney, Acting Editor of Logistics Manager Magazine. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Thank you, guys.